Chapter 14 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 14. Gore and Dreams. It was a two-masted felucca with lateen sails. The craft was long and low. In it were more than 50 men, 20 or 30 of whom were at oars with which the craft was being propelled from the lee of the land. I was dumbfounded. Could it be that the savage, painted natives I had seen on shore had so perfected the art of navigation that they were masters of such advanced building and rigging as this craft proclaimed? It seemed impossible. As I looked, I saw another of the same type swing into view and follow its sister through the narrow strait out into the ocean. Nor were these all. One after another, following closely upon one another's heels, came 50 of the trim, graceful vessels. They were cutting in between Hoja's fleet and our little dugout. When they came a bit closer, my eyes fairly popped from my head at what I saw, for in the eye of the leading felucca stood a man with a sea glass level upon us. Who could they be? Was there a civilization within Pellucidar of such wondrous advancement as this? Were there far distant lands of which none of my people had ever heard, where a race had so greatly outstripped all other races of this inner world? The man with the glass had lowered it and was shouting to us. I could not make out his words, but presently I saw that he was pointing aloft. When I looked, I saw a pennant fluttering from the peak of the forward lateen yard, a red, white, and blue pennant, with a single great white star in a field of blue. Then I knew. My eyes went even wider than they had before. It was the navy! It was the navy of the empire of Pellucidar, which I had instructed Perry to build in my absence. It was my navy. I dropped my paddle and stood up and shouted and waved my hand. Juog and Diane looked at me as if I had gone suddenly mad. When I could stop shouting, I told them, and they shared my joy and shouted with me. But still Hooja was coming nearer, nor could the leading felucca overhaul him before he would be alongside or at least within bowshot. Hooja must have been as much mystified as we were as to the identity of the strange fleet, but when he saw me waving to them, he evidently guessed that they were friendly to us, so he urged his men to redouble their efforts to reach us before the felucca cut him off. He shouted word back to others of his fleet, word that was passed back until it had reached them all, directing them to run alongside the strangers and board them, for with his 200 craft and his 8 or 10,000 warriors, he evidently felt equal to overcoming the 50 vessels of the enemy, which did not seem to carry over 3,000 men all told. His own personal energies he bent to reaching Diane and me first, leaving the rest of the work to his other boats. I thought that there could be little doubt that he would be successful in so far as we were concerned, and I feared for the revenge that he might take upon us should the battle go against his force, as I was sure it would, for I knew that Perry and his Mezops must have brought with them all the arms and ammunition that had been contained in the prospector. But I was not prepared for what happened next. As Hooja's canoe reached a point some 20 yards from us, a great puff of smoke broke from the bow of the leading felucca, followed almost simultaneously by a terrific explosion, and a solid shot screamed close over the heads of the men in Hooja's craft, raising a great splash where it clove the water just beyond them. Perry had perfected gunpowder and built cannon. It was marvelous. Diane and Juog, as much surprised as Hooja, turned wondering eyes toward me. Again the cannon spoke. I suppose that by comparison with the great guns of modern naval vessels of the outer world, it was a pitifully small and inadequate thing, but here in Pellucidar, where it was the first of its kind, it was about as awe-inspiring as anything you might imagine. With the report, an iron cannonball about 5 inches in diameter struck Hooja's dugout just above the waterline, tore a great splintering hole in its side, turned it over, and dumped its occupants into the sea. The 4 dugouts that had been abreast of Hooja had turned to intercept the leading felucca. Even now, in the face of what must have been a withering catastrophe to them, they kept bravely on toward the strange and terrible craft. In them were fully 200 men, while but 50 lined the gunwale of the felucca to repel them. The commander of the felucca, who proved to be Ja, let them come quite close and then turned loose upon them a volley of shots from small arms. The cave men and Sagos in the dugouts seemed to wither before that blast of death like dry grass before a prairie fire. Those who were not hit dropped their bows and javelins and seizing upon paddles attempted to escape. But the felucca pursued them relentlessly, her crew firing at will. At last I heard Ja shouting to the survivors in the dugouts, they were all quite close to us now, offering them their lives if they would surrender. Perry was standing close behind Ja, and I knew that this merciful action was prompted, perhaps commanded, by the old man, for no Pellucidarian would have thought of showing leniency to a defeated foe. As there was no alternative save death, the survivors surrendered, and a moment later were taken aboard the Amaz, the name that I could now see printed in large letters upon the felucca's bow, and which no one in that whole world could read except Perry and I. When the prisoners were aboard, Ja brought the felucca alongside our dugout. Many were the willing hands that reached down to lift us to her decks. The bronze faces of the Mezops were broad with smiles, and Perry was fairly beside himself with joy. Diane went aboard first, and then Juag, as I wished to help Raja and Rene aboard myself, well knowing that it would fare ill with any Mezop who touched them. We got them aboard at last, and a great commotion they caused among the crew, who had never seen a wild beast thus handled by man before. Perry and Diane and I were so full of questions that we fairly burst, but we had to contain ourselves for a while, since the battle with the rest of Hooge's fleet had scarce commenced. From the small forward decks of the feluccas, Perry's crude cannon were belching smoke, flame, thunder, and death. The air trembled to the roar of them. Hooge's horde, intrepid, savage fighters that they were closing in to grapple in a last death struggle with the Mezops who manned our vessels. The handling of our fleet by the Red Island warriors of Ja's clan was far from perfect. I could see that Perry had lost no time after the completion of the boats in setting out upon this cruise. What little the captains and crews had learned of handling feluccas they must have learned principally since they embarked upon this voyage, and while experience is an excellent teacher and had done much for them, they still had a great deal to learn. In maneuvering for position they were continually fouling one another, and on 2 occasions shots from our batteries came near to striking our own ships. No sooner, however, was I aboard the flagship than I attempted to rectify this trouble to some extent. By passing commands by word of mouth from one ship to another, I managed to get the 50 feluccas into some sort of line, with the flagship in the lead. In this formation we commenced slowly to circle the position of the enemy. The dugouts came for us right along in an attempt to board us, but by keeping on the move in one direction and circling, we managed to avoid getting in each other's way, and were enabled to fire our cannon and small arms with less danger to our own comrades. When I had a moment to look about me, I took in the felucca on which I was. I am free to confess that I marveled at the excellent construction and staunch yet speedy lines of the little craft. That Perry had chosen this type of vessel seemed rather remarkable, for though I had warned him against turreted battleships, armor, and like useless show, I had fully expected that when I beheld his navy I should find considerable attempt at grim and terrible magnificence, for it was always Perry's idea to overawe these ignorant cave-men when we had to contend with them in battle. But I had soon learned that while one might easily astonish them with some new engine of war, it was an utter impossibility to frighten them into surrender. I learned later that Ja had gone carefully over the plans of various craft with Perry. The old man had explained in detail all that the text told him of them. The two had measured out dimensions upon the ground, that Ja might see the sizes of different boats. Perry had built models, and Ja had had him read carefully and explain all that they could find relative to the handling